Hello and welcome to the Horticulturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas, and we post a video every Friday, so do hit subscribe and the alert button if you want to know exactly when our videos hit the ether.
Yes, and if you've got a gardening question, don't hesitate to put it in the comments section below, and we will get round to answering it in our Monday shorts.
We will indeed, but Stephen, firstly, there's a very large variegated tree behind me, so I'm being triggered.
Yes, you
Where
are.
are we?
All right, we're at a rather charming garden called Maranoa Gardens in Balwyn, which is one of the leafy suburbs of Melbourne.
Yes.
And we're going to meet the horticultural specialist here, and she's going to talk us through the garden. And I have to say, I have a memory of this garden because when I was a young horticultural student doing my training, we came on an excursion to Maranoa Gardens. So dare I give my age away a little bit and say that was probably in the mid-1970s. And
You were a precocious child, Stephen.
No, I was an expert horticulturalist even then. And that tree behind us, that one over there that's triggered you a bit because it's seriously variegated, is the variegated Queensland box that at the time I would have known as Tristania conferta. It's now Lophostemon confertus, and it's a Queensland native tree in the Myrtaceae family. Has a wonderful trunk. The variegated form is one of the most strikingly variegated plants I think I've ever seen. And I remember that very tree. It's one of the major memories of my trip there. And that's probably what started me having a thing about variegates. I don't know.
So that's the tree to blame.
Yes.
Well, we might come back to that tree, but I think what we should do now is go and meet Andrea and just talk about the history of this amazing garden.
Yes, let's do that. Matthew, I'd like to introduce Andrea Dennis to you.
Hello, Andrea.
Hello, Matthew.
Thanks for having us today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yes. Andrea is a horticultural specialist working with the council and I guess basically in charge of this fabulous garden.
Which I just live down the road and I have been to many times. It was one of my COVID hangouts, Andrea. I think it's probably many people's COVID hangouts.
It was. We didn't realise how popular the garden was at that time, and we were getting numbers of 400 people a day, which, when they all turn up at once,
was illegal.
Yes.
It got us to think and to actually start talking to people about what a botanic garden is and why this was valuable, because so many people hadn't been here.
Yeah. Well, it is a little bit of a secret place in a way. I mean, horticulturalists sort of know it exists, but a lot of the general public don't know that Maranoa Gardens is here, which is odd because, tell us, Andrea, when did this garden actually start?
So Maranoa Gardens began in 1901 as a private garden when a mercantile broker called John Middleton Watson bought 4 blocks of land here. There was never a house, and the idea was that at that time his wife did not want him to take his daughters out to see the Australian bush. So he started to build...
Because that was unladylike, perhaps.
Yeah,
that's amazing. So this was never a house site. I just assumed that, that a guy bought the land, built his house and created an Australian native garden.
So was his sort of modus operandi to create a safe native garden that he could take his daughters to?
No, I think it was more along the lines of I think there was a family interest in botany, and that he had at one point walked from Melbourne, according to some of the family history, all the way to Queensland, the Maranoa border river area.
So that's where the name comes from.
Right.
That was another question I was going to ask.
Well, it's answered now, Stephen, right?
It is.
And he's supposed to have collected some seed along the way.
Wow.
So it is really interesting because Australia only became Australia in 1900. So basically at Federation, here we've got a man who buys land, not to build a house on, but to start a garden. He starts with Australian natives. Now, I read somewhere that he was also collecting New Zealand native plants back then as well.
There were New Zealand plants here too. 2 that I remember would have been Vitex and Sephora tetraptera, yellow koi. About the only New Zealand plant here today is the odd mirror bush that comes in.
Yeah, which we don't want.
Which we don't want.
No, dreadful weed. So he was sort of thinking well ahead of the stream, because when you consider it way back then, Australian bush, as we call it, we don't call our bush anything interesting like forest or woodland or whatever. We call it bush, which tends to be somewhat derogatory. And that's because all we wanted to do was clear it and put pasture in and what have you.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So here's a guy that actually was creating one way back then. So obviously at some point or another, it became too much for him, or he passed away or whatever. So where did the garden go from that point?
When he started it, he was already in his 60s. And this was pretty much a retirement project, we believe. In about 1920, the city of Camberwell, as we were then, began negotiations with him. Negotiations were complete by about 1922, and it was on the proviso that it wasn't formally open to the public until after his death. He would retain a life interest.
And when did he die?
18th of July, 1926.
And the gates were open.
And the gates were opened on the 26th of September after probate.
Right,
Goodness me.
And I'm presuming there are still things that he planted here.
Definitely.
A lot of the trees, obviously.
Yeah, because there's certainly some very large old eucalypts and other native trees on the site. So his idea was to create this mini botanic gardens of Australian native plants. The council's taken it over. Did they realise what they'd taken over, and did they continue on in like vein, trying to keep it the way it was?
Yes and no. Yes, as in the council did continue with the planting mostly of Australian plants, with a few New Zealand. One of the main changes would have been in the early 1930s when Frederick Chapman was appointed the honorary curator. He was a paleontologist with the Melbourne Museum, but he had a huge interest in Australian plants. And in, I think, 1932, the decision was made by him to stop putting in New Zealand plants, to start slowly removing them, and to increase the amount of Australian plants. Back then, the record was there are 70 Australian shrubs and trees in this garden. Now, we've probably got over 5,000 individual plants.
Wow. Now, we were joking earlier, so now we're going to fast forward from the 30s to the 60s, because the cunning observer might notice there's quite wide pavements behind us.
Far wider than you generally would need.
Tell us the story of the paving of Maranoa Gardens.
That was one of our biggest changes. 1962, councils were doing a lot of paving, a lot of development, and the decision was made to actually put a road through Maranoa Gardens from one gate all the way round to the Chapman Gate, so that people could drive through and not get out of their cars to see the plants.
What heaven! What a great idea for Botanic Garden, to not get out and look at anything. Isn't that hilarious? So let's talk about the garden today. So there's this incredible history for a small sort of inner city.
Actually, we haven't mentioned how small or how big it is.
How big?
Yes, how big is the garden? That's really important.
Not that small, really, is it?
In preparation, I had to look this up this morning because that is one of the few things that I can never remember.
How much land have you got?
2.7 hectares.
Right, and acres for our American viewers, what would that be roughly?
About 6.5.
I was going to say six something. Yeah, so it's a good sized block of ground, and it's registered as a botanic garden. So it is actually a registered botanic gardens.
Its place name is registered.
Yeah.
Something that we are very proud of is that we have international accreditation as a botanic garden.
Which I guess then naturally segues to the garden today. So here you are. What's your, I guess, not agenda, but what's your ambition now? So what are you really passionate about the garden doing and being for you, and also for the next sort of generation as the garden evolves?
I think one of the big things is to maintain what we have, to try and progress fairly sensitively as well. I mean, we know that we have some old trees here that are going to start to fail, and we are working with the planners within council to try and come together with a bit of a program on how we do that.
So a sort of succession plan for the garden itself, which is fair enough.
Sourcing of those plants can sometimes be a little bit difficult. We'll go almost anywhere for plants.
Andrea, thank you so much for your time. It's just started to rain, but we are going to go and dive in and look at some interesting things in the garden. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's plenty here. Come and have a look.
Excellent. Elephant in the room. It is raining. I'm holding an umbrella over the camera, so you will hear the pitter-patter of rain.
Yes.
But now, Stephen, beneath the spreading arbour of a variegated tree.
Yes.
So this is the tree of your horticultural dreams.
No, I don't know whether it's a horticultural dreams, but it's certainly a tree that I remember from my childhood. So it's been around for a long time. And I have to say I have a love-hate relationship with large trees that are variegated, and I may have well said this at different times, but if a tree is large and it's not completely stable in its variegation, you will get green pieces in the tree.
Yeah.
This one has got a few small green sections in the tree, but I have to say they've done a reasonably good job managing this tree in all those years since I remember it as a young horticulturalist, because I've seen many of these Lophostemons around the place that have half the tree's gone back to green. And once it gets to that point, then you might as well either take the tree out or just let the green take over, because you're never going to be able to pull it back to being variegated again.
So you have to maintain it really every year, don't you?
You need to look at it regularly, at least assess the tree every year. You may not have to prune the green pieces out every year, but yes, you do have to assess it regularly. But it is quite a striking tree. I mean, the bark is stunning.
Yeah.
If you look at the base of it closely, you can see that it's actually a grafted specimen. So you can see there's a slight variation in the bark. So I think they're still generally grafted, because I don't think it's easy to strike from cuttings. If you're looking for a very in-your-face striking tree, and they obviously were when they planted this, because it's just inside the front gates, it's the first tree that hits you as you come in. So I think it's been planted here for its wow power.
And it is beautiful. You know, it does look great, I'm here to say. Now, interestingly, this is a Queensland species, and yet you see the box trees and the variegated ones throughout Victoria.
Oh, yeah.
So they're obviously able to take the much cooler temperatures that
happen. They can come down to quite low temperatures. They're pretty iffy in my climate at Mount Macedon. I mean, I know of one or two around, but they've never been good trees. So it's just that little bit too cold climate intolerant for us. But certainly around suburban Melbourne, it's being used a lot, particularly the green one as a street tree.
Talking of which then, it's evergreen and shady. So what has been underplanted here?
All right, well, they've used a fairly classical Australian native plant as a ground cover that is drought and heat and dry tolerant, and that's one of the Lomandras. And they're a sort of strappy, grassy, reedy looking plant. The flowers are not particularly exciting. They get little spikes of creamy, greeny, browny flowers in them, but their strappy foliage makes for a very nice contrast and a very good textural quality.
It is. And also, this isn't, I mean, this is not a huge tree, but it's been here for what?
I was told 1962 it was planted.
I was surprised, because it looks like it would be about 20 years old, but so obviously slow growing. And Andrew was explaining that's a lot to do with the soil here and the bed. Yeah,
the soil's apparently comparatively shallow and it gets quite dry. So the Queensland box has survived well, but it hasn't grown remarkably fast in all that time. Having said that, were it a green one, it would probably be a tree 3 or 4 times this size, because the variegation does hold them back.
I was going to say that, but it's not a huge tree, even as a mature green specimen, is it?
No, they're not vast trees. So yes, you could use them as a smaller garden tree, but their root system's reasonably strong. So yes, your underplanting is important.
Okay, on to the next.
Yes.
So interesting, 1901. So there's sort of like a central area in the middle of the garden. So how would you describe this as a garden design?
I would say it probably is Gardenesque. So that sort of English style of vaguely naturalistic, sweeping edges, nothing straight, nothing formal, and yet done in Australian native plants, which would have to be one of the very earliest attempts at an Australian native garden in that sort of style.
Yeah.
And when you got to the 1960s, that's when things started to change and people started to re-engage with our natives. But what they were doing was they were planting them in what I call Morse code gardening, which is 3 rocks, a railway sleeper, 3 rocks, another railway sleeper, and lots of bush mulch, which was the way they thought that Australian native plants should look. So obviously not coming at it from that particular angle. The original designer of this garden followed British type landscape principles, but used Australian plants, which is fabulous.
Yeah. And I guess where we're at today is like a hybrid, so that Australian modern gardens are using Australian natives and other sort of dry climate, well, depends where we are, but more dry tolerant plants in a more sort of often Gardenesque way.
Yeah,
and sometimes in like a more modernist way. But
Yeah, our natives have shown themselves to be adaptable enough in different landscape styles that in fact we don't have to do Morse code gardening.
No.
We can actually do our natives in lots of different ways, and many of them trim as good hedges or topiary. So yeah, there's lots and lots of different aspects about our natives that we've come to appreciate.
Yeah, and I guess I mean for 1901, it's fascinating. I mean, it's revolutionary almost. So there are three key areas, aren't there? There's a Gardenesque bit in the middle. Then there's a tropical walk, which we'll go and have a look at in the rain.
Yeah, in the rain,
and
yes.
an arid section, ironically.
Yes,
in the
exactly.
rain.
So yeah, so the garden is cut up into different sections that are showcasing different styles of Australian plants, and the actual landscape itself is also diverse. So you can see plants being used in lots of different ways.
Well, talking of which then, we're going to cunningly move the camera around to show behind us
Yes.
the Xanthorrhoea, so the grass tree. So Xanthorrhoea, you've got one in your garden.
Yes, I have. Mine's the Victorian one. This one behind us is one of the Western Australian species, which is slightly greyer in foliage and with slightly broader leaves on it, which sort of gives it away. And it's a fantastic sort of focal point plant.
It's really sculptural. I think for me, that's the interesting thing about where it's been placed. And we'll show you it's on the edge of a border, and in a more sort of European garden, it would be like a feature shrub that will be in that spot.
Yes.
Maybe a foliage thing or something that flowers. Whereas here, you've got this amazing spiky, glaucous-y foliage. And it looks amazing.
Yep.
Also, it's really wet.
Yes.
And that comes from a much drier climate. And yet,
Yeah, well, the soil here is obviously well enough drained, so the plant is managing perfectly well.
and Andrea did say we're quite elevated.
Yeah.
We're on a bit of a crest of a hill. So let's go and look at some other aspects of the Gardenesque bit and just show the people what that looks like.
Yes.
This is, we describe this as Gardenesque. So,
Yes.
I mean, for my benefit and the other viewers, what
Yeah.
does that mean? What is Gardenesque design?
Well, it's basically a backlash against the very formal garden that was very popular way back, and also that high Victorian gardening with carpet bedding, grotesque rockeries, you know, all that sort of thing that...
Grotesque?
Well, they were, you know, rocks sticking up on edge and really weird stuff, and there's still some examples of that in some Melbourne suburban gardens. So it was a backlash against that. So they wanted to have something that was more naturalistic, but they still wanted their sweeping lawns and all that sort of thing that they could wander across, or in fact promenade. And so it was sort of midway between a truly naturalistic garden and the formal one. So that's exactly what they tried to do, and that's what they created here.
So obviously in Europe, you obviously have deciduous trees or conifers,
Yeah.
but here there's the most beautiful, and if you just stand there, look
There,
at that, look
yes.
at that eucalypt, look at the bark on it, it's stunning.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful tree.
We'll look at a few other eucalypts that have amazing bark, and then the other thing, Gardenesque design,
Yeah.
is this amazing strappy leaf plant behind me, which many Australians will be familiar with.
Oh,
but
yes.
those of our viewers not from Australia,
Yes.
what is that amazing point
It's a-
punctuating that moment?
It's a shame it's not in bloom as well, because then it's eye-droppingly beautiful.
Yeah.
It's one of our lilies, a Gymea lily, or Doryanthes as they're botanically known. And there's two species, Palmeri and Excelsa. One has balls of flowers and the other has long sprays of flowers, but the foliage is basically much the same in both species. And they are wonderful plants from northern New South Wales.
And for those of you who've never seen one in bloom, the flower spike is 10 feet?
Yeah, easily 3 metres, 4 metres tall.
Amazing. And then-
remarkable.
The one that has a ball of flowers, it's the ball of scarlet lily
Yep.
flowers. It's the most extraordinary thing. But here, I just love the way it's been used on the corner of the lawn there, which again, in a European garden, might be a pampas grass or something, I don't know.
It could be a daphnously draped Diana. You know, I mean, sculptural elements
True,
were very
true, true.
popular as well.
Yeah, anyway, a gorgeous moment in this garden, particularly the eucalypts in the lawn.
Yep.
So obviously it's a botanic garden, Stephen, so
Yeah.
there are great collections. And look, cycads.
Yes. Yes, one of those wonderful ancient groups of plants that Australia has quite a number of representatives of.
Yeah.
And they're the sort of plants that were particularly popular in Victorian times because they were exotic and tropical looking and you know, intrigued people. So they became quite major collectors' plants. And this is one of our Lepidozamias, one called peroffskyana. And it is truly a remarkable looking palm type plant. So lovely in the garden. And again, it's been used as a sort of focal point on the end of a bed. So it's a bit of an exclamation mark in the garden.
And that's a particular beautiful form there. Now, we saw an amazing hedge of them in the Cranbourne Botanic Garden.
Yes, they had a lovely row of them there. Which
never seen
yeah.
the like of that before.
Yeah.
Now, are cycads from every continent?
More or less. Certainly cycads go right up into Asia. There's some Japanese ones, Chinese ones.
Yeah.
They go across to Africa.
Any European cycads?
I am not sure. That's something I would have to look up. So I'm not dead sure whether they extend into Europe, but it's certainly not impossible because there's certainly some in China.
And there's also obviously some from the Americas. I know there's Mexican ones. So I presume there's North America and South American.
So most parts of the world have their cycads, and certainly they would have been all over the world back in prehistoric times. But of course, many of them are now completely under threat through global warming, through collecting, through clearing. You know, so a lot of cycads are definitely under threat. And for a long time in Australia, they were cleared out of areas because they're poisonous to stock. So they didn't want them growing in areas where they might have cattle or sheep grazing.
And a lot are very slow growing too, aren't they?
They are. They take years to grow. So if you're growing them commercially, it takes a long time to get your seed germinated and up to a saleable sort of plant. So if you're buying a big cycad, expect to pay a fair bit of money for one.
There you go. Ambling to the lavatory block.
As you do.
The most amazing Dendrobium speciosum. So this is an Australian native orchid, sometimes called the Sydney rock orchid.
And it is a fabulous, very spectacular species in its genus. And I love the way that they've used it here and planted it into the top of an old eucalypt stump. So instead of removing the stump from the garden, they've turned it into a useful habitat for something.
And it's just coming in spike now. It's such a pity that it only bloomed, because that will be a sight to behold.
Oh, well, we may have to come back and visit it when it's in flower.
We might.
Yes.
On to the next. It's stopped raining, Stephen.
For the moment. Yes, so we're still a little damp, but we'll manage.
And cold.
Yeah.
But here we are at the entrance to the tropical garden. And to be clear, Melbourne ain't tropical.
No, it isn't. But it's certainly not Arctic either.
No.
So we can grow a wide range of tropical plants, and also a plant doesn't necessarily have to be tropical to have a tropical look. So that's the important thing too.
We've been through this with your garden, achieving a tropical look. We've got a video about that. But I think too, what's kind of clear in this garden is that although some species that we're looking at, which are all Australian natives, are from the tropical parts of the country, weirdly, they seem unaffected by our cold, damp winters.
Yeah, well, we don't get a lot of frost in Melbourne, so it's more about frost and repetitive frost, because some plants will cope with one or two light frosts.
Right.
But if they happen day after day after day after day, then they have a sort of a cumulative effect.
So it's not so much the rain and the cold, it's the sub-zero,
because
sub 32 degrees.
Frost actually freezes the cells in the leaves of plants, whereas low temperatures, plants can often cope with that. But when their cells are frozen, the moisture in them expands, and that breaks the cell walls, and that's why plants collapse and turn into mush. So there you go.
So interesting. But I mean, the other thing is too that some tropical and subtropical plants are fine in Melbourne.
Yeah.
But others aren't.
Yeah, well, it's about the leaf structure as much as anything.
Right.
So, for instance sake, a lot of the palms do well down here because their leaves are quite hard and firm and are less likely to be damaged by the cold. You've also got to remember too that when a plant gets up to a certain height, it tends to be above the frost. So once they grow up into tall plants, then if they'd been a little tiny one in the garden, they may well have frosted out, but they're not going to do it once they get to be tree proportioned.
Well, we should do a walk and talk through here, but you are the king of frost avoidance and zonal denial, which we've made a video about too, making things thrive where they shouldn't.
Yes, well, exactly. Well, we all want to have what we shouldn't have, aren't we? Isn't that human nature?
Oh, yeah. I want chocolate cake and hot coffee right now, although I don't even drink coffee. All right, let's go for a walk through the tropical garden.
All right, let's.
Well, strolling through reminds me of obviously the Melbourne Botanic Garden.
Yes.
So what have we got here?
All right. Well, there's beautiful bird's nest ferns. There's giant crinums. There's palms above our heads. There's dracaenas, the sort of cordyline looking things.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of strappy leaf things. There's some nice Doryanthes in here. So all these plants exude a tropical exuberance that is exactly what you're looking for in this sort of garden.
But actually, you did notice something fabulous in that fern at the very beginning. So let's go and have another look at that.
Yes, let's have a look at it. Well, I have to say, Something that really intrigues me to see in the garden here is a plant that, yes, is Australian native, but it also is from New Zealand. So it's harking back to the early history of this garden. And it's an Asplenium, Asplenium bulbiferum. It's a spleenwort fern, or we sometimes call it here hen and chickens. And the interesting thing about this particular fern is that on the tops of the fronds it produces tiny little bulbils, and quite often in the hundreds, and they become little baby ferns, and as the fern frond dies and falls to the ground, the little baby ferns will take root, and it's one of the major techniques that this particular plant uses for propagating.
Variegation, Stephen, that even you have to admit isn't earth-shattering.
No, look, I mean, there are some plants that throw variegated sports that probably should end up in the compost, some of which are marginally attractive, some of which are stunning. I mean, the variegated Queensland box that we saw is an absolutely stunning variegation. This is a variegated selection of Eucalyptus maculata, the spotted gum, and I have to say, I'm not overly impressed.
I, though, have never seen a variegated eucalypt, so it is striking. I mean, the leaf sort of structure and colour is also, I'm not sure this is a particularly happy specimen, but maybe a healthier tree. Mind you, all variegation looks diseased.
So you say. But I believe one of these variegated eucalypts was actually brought out onto the market as a fundraiser for a cancer fund. I hope they raise lots of money with it, but I'm not sure that it's one of those plants that's going to hold its own in gardens. And of course, as I mentioned with the variegated Queensland box, when they get up to big trees, if they start reverting back to green, you've got to bring the tree surgeons in to deal with them. So I do have some aversion to large trees that are variegated. If it's a shrub, I can manage it. But big trees, if they revert, are a real pain.
And talking of big trees, the eucalypt right in front of us. So that's the great thing about this garden, the Gardenesque.
Yeah.
Where you'd see perhaps conifers or oaks in a European garden. Here, there are magnificent
stunning
eucalypts. What's this one?
That's Eucalyptus scoparia, and it is a beautiful trunk, wonderful bark, fabulous canopy. So it is a really, really beautiful eucalypt.
Okay, on to the next. Well, we're in the Arid garden and it's raining,
Yes,
Stephen.
exactly. It's hardly arid today, but this is a wonderful representative collection of some of our more dry climate plants, particularly quite a number of very attractive Western Australian natives. So a very pretty area of the garden.
And a lot of colour in winter too. And I think what's interesting, if you just stand aside, Mr. Ryan, that way.
Yes, I will move out.
You can see that a lot of the beds are raised.
Yes. Which of course is important for those plants that like good drainage, where they naturally come from.
And Andrea's point too, a lot of these in the Arid garden are on grafted rootstock.
Yeah, well, some of the Western Australian natives, even if you've got a well-drained sandy soil, still don't do well in a different climatic zone. So grafting them onto tougher species in the same genus actually works wonderfully.
There you go. Well, it would be great to walk through with you, but it's raining, so we can't.
No, it is just so wet today. But we will have a look at a few of the interesting plants here, I guess.
We will.
All right, this caught my attention, I have to say. It's another one of the Western Australian native plants. Probably not the most tidy of shrubs. It's a rather leggy, lanky sort of plant. But when it comes out into flower, this Guichenotia macrantha from Western Australia in the Malvaceae family, so in the same family as the hibiscus, is a charming plant, and I'm sure I'd forgive it every year when it came into bloom.
Well, Stephen, the rain is setting in, but this colour just catches your eye. My goodness, I love that. What on earth is it?
Well, it's another one of the Western Australians, so it's an Isopogon cuneatus, and again, it's another plant in the Proteaceae family, and it is just a most stunningly beautiful plant. I wouldn't think very hardy. I wouldn't expect it to grow in heavy clay soils. It certainly won't cope with much frost, but if you've got the right climate, it's a fabulous plant, and it also makes quite a nice cut flower. So,
does it?
Yes, I think it would be a lovely plant to have in your garden and pick a posy for the kitchen table. Why not, indeed?
Such an interesting flower, and it's growing next to a wattle, and that sort of mauvey purple and the yellow such a great combination together.
They're beautiful.
Well, Stephen, I've loved coming to this garden, which is literally just up the road from my house.
A little further away from me, but anyhow, you've got to share these things out. It's been fabulous to come back here after all these years. I mean, I haven't been here since the 1970s.
Haven't you?
No, so there you go. So
I didn't realise that.
yeah, so I made one visit here as a young apprentice with my school. That's the last time I was here.
Well, very interesting. I mean, it's a really important Australian garden in terms of the use of native plants from such an early point in history.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's quite unique in a way, and it's hidden in suburban Melbourne, and I'll bet half the Melbourne population don't know it even exists.
Well, I'll put the link below to the website so you'll know exactly where it is. And if you want to know exactly what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe.
And don't forget, if you've got a question about anything, horticultural of course, pop it in the comments below and we will answer it on our Monday shorts.
We will, but until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.